It's story time. I'm going to read this story, ShandraLa. This is an allegory about laying up your treasures in heaven and what that might be like. And it's also a story about a miniature mermaid and her friends. So I'm going to read it. Chapter 1, ShandraLa's World. Swimming along gracefully in her underwater world, ShandraLa enjoyed watching the yellow shafts of sunlight dancing among the murky green shadows of the seaweed that surrounded her like a submarine forest. Her bright green eyes caught every movement amidst its waving grasses, while her long brown tresses flowed out behind her like a bridal train. In among the towering seaweed, she knew her favorite seahorse was grazing somewhere. Oh well, he had to come out sooner or later because he would miss the sweet treats that she kept in her bag for him, and she did not want to risk getting lost in the seaweed forest because of looking for him. So she stayed on the pebble-strewn path that led her through the seaweed, out into the clearing where her village had grown up over the years. On entering the village, ShandraLa saw her cousin Tiara greeting her and waving to her to come over to her house. "Look at what I found!" Tiara exclaimed as soon as ShandraLa was within hearing distance. ShandraLa saw that Tiara was kneeling beside a large, almost rectangular, purple rock, and as she came around to it, to the side Tiara was on, she saw that it had been hollowed out on that side. Leaning down to look inside, ShandraLa saw that someone had carved a beautiful three-dimensional scene inside, with scenery in the background and figures of people such as ShandraLa and her cousin interacting with their animal friends in the foreground. "Wow," ShandraLa remarked, "that is really nice. How did you find that?" "Well," Tiara began, still flushed with excitement, "I was playing hide-and-seek with my crayfish when I saw that this rock was hollowed out, and I thought it would have been the perfect place for him to hide, but when I looked inside, I saw all this." Smiling, ShandraLa congratulated her cousin on her find. Just then, they heard a cry coming up from further on in the village. Looking up, ShandraLa saw the enormous eel that sometimes terrorized the populace of her village. "Come on, Tiara, we have to hide in the seaweed," ShandraLa warned her cousin urgently as the villagers ran by them in a panic. But Tiara was so absorbed with her new find that she threw herself over it instead, as if to protect it from the eel at the expense of herself. "No, Tiara, don't worry about that," ShandraLa pleaded. "You are more important." Overhead they heard the ominous sound of the eel's eerie wail. Starting, Tiara changed her plan and tried to drag the heavy rock with her, but it refused to budge an inch. "Oh my," ShandraLa moaned, grabbing her cousin by the arms and dragging her along with her as she fled toward the shelter of the forest. Suddenly the eel struck, electricity flying everywhere, lighting up the shadows cast by the eel as he lunged toward them with his rows of sharp teeth showing. Suddenly Tiara seemed to come to her senses, or so ShandraLa judged, by the screaming and fleeing she suddenly began to engage in on her own. So far they had managed to get only behind Tiara's house, which the eel mistakenly took a bite out of in his hasty attempt to get at them. Roaring in anger and the pain of teeth that had broken against the solid rock portions of Tiara's house, the eel backed up long enough for ShandraLa and Tiara to make a break for it. But they had such a late start that the eel had time to recover and start after them again. Tiara's shrieks filled ShandraLa's ears so that it was hard to think, but she swooped down and grabbed a fist-sized rock as she fled, turning for a split second as she felt the eel right behind her. She thrust it as hard as she could, right into his eye. Then she swam like she had never swam before, reaching the safety of the seaweed forest right on Tiara's tail fins. The eel's roar now filled their ears, and blood began to cloud the water around the eel. Turning away, the eel writhed and wailed and made small attempts at retreat until the water's gentle current slowly swept him out of their view. Letting out a long sigh of relief, ShandraLa realized that she had been holding her breath for a while. Glancing over at her cousin, she saw that Tiara sat slumping against some seaweed with a glazed look in her eyes. She was in shock. What had come over her, back there by the purple rock with the scene in it? Why would she risk her life and lose her senses over a trinket, really? Slowly, the other villagers were coming out of hiding and heading back to their houses to see if any damage had been done. Tiara's parents stood with their arms around each other, looking sadly at the remains of their house. It would take time to rebuild, but at least they were all safe. A bit of damage here and there had been done to the other houses by the thrashing of the eel's tail, but nothing that couldn't be fixed in a day or two. Making her way back to her own house, ShandraLa met her parents on the way. When they arrived at their own dwelling, they saw that it was untouched by the eel, so they went to lend a hand to their closest neighbors, whose house had been damaged by the eel's tail. Then ShandraLa's family and their neighbor's family went to see how they could help Tiara's family, as the news had traveled of the most unfortunate house in the village. Over the next few weeks, the small band of helpers rebuilt Tiara's house. One day, ShandraLa's ancient grandmother Myrtle was suddenly nowhere to be found. "Where is grandmother?" ShandraLa asked her mother. "Your grandmother has morphed," her mother replied. "Morphed? What do you mean?" ShandraLa asked, with a sense of loss and sadness coming over her. "Now, ShandraLa," her mother replied, "you know that we don't live in our underwater world forever. Every one of us morphs when our life has been lived. Your grandmother is in a better place now, living with the king and receiving the rewards of what she did with her life." "Tell me again about morphing and about the king," ShandraLa begged her mother. Smiling, her mother sat down beside her and began. "The king created the very first of our people and placed us in our world under the shimmery veil above us. But he did not mean for this to be all we ever knew. This world is only a preparation for the world we will know after we morph." "Did you see grandmother morph?" ShandraLa suddenly asked. Chuckling softly, as she knew what ShandraLa really wanted to know, her mother replied, "Yes, dear, I saw her. After the bubble came down and surrounded her, her cold fins became soft white feet, with legs covered by her new white dress, and beautiful butterfly wings sprouted from her shoulder blades. She became young again, and smiling and waving at me, she was carried up to the shimmery veil above, where she popped through it into the world of the king." "Wow," ShandraLa said, awestruck and gazing into the distance, imagining what it must be like to morph. Fascinated by the stories of the king's land, she had often gazed up at the veil that shimmered and gently moved in the waves, but only reflected the underwater world that she knew. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," her mother continued. "She spent her life doing good to others. This is how you ensure that your life on the other side will be happy and full of good things." Chapter 2. The Dwellers of a Faraway Water. Time passed, and ShandraLa and Tiara grew up. Tiara developed a passion for jewelry, beautiful blouses, and colorful stones for her house. In time she married, but she still spent most of her time gathering these kinds of things. As time passed, she had more and more things, and she had to gather more and more beautiful stones to build more rooms on her house to contain all of her beautiful things. Spending so much of her time gathering things and building onto her house, she never had time to bear children. Every morning her husband emerged out of the stuff to go to work, and every evening he was swallowed up again by the house full of beautiful things. On the other hand, ShandraLa lived a simple life, enjoying riding her seahorse in the late afternoons and spending her days helping the elderly with tasks that they had grown too old and weary to handle themselves, and teaching the children how to ride and take care of seahorses. One day, as ShandraLa had just finished lessons for the day and was saddling up her seahorse for a ride, she spotted an old friend swimming towards her, looking like he wanted to talk to her. "Hello, Appy," she called to him. His real name was Apostolos, but she always called him Appy for short. "What brings you my way?" she asked as he came closer. "Well, it's kind of a long story," he replied. "Do you have time?" "Of course," she replied, sitting down on a nearby rock. Appy sat down on a rock near hers. "A few months ago, I was exploring the tunnels with a couple of friends of mine," he began. "We had often played in the tunnels while we were growing up, but we decided to map them and explore them to see where they led to, if anywhere. After about a month, we discovered that one of them led to another water different from our own. The people there don't have the abundance of food and building materials that we have here. And that's not the biggest difference we discovered. As we stayed and got to know them more, we found that their people do not morph when their life is over. They die like an animal, and their friends and family are left with a body that they have to bury. After talking to them at length to find out why, we discovered that they do not know the king. They have never even heard of him. Can you imagine? Such a terrible existence they have." Imagining it, ShandraLa shook her head with a look of concern taking over her face. "What can we do?" she asked. "Well, what I was hoping you could do is provide us with some seahorses that are trained to pull sleds," Appy replied, "because the first thing we want to do is bring food and building materials to the people there to help end their hunger and exposure. While we take care of that, we will tell them the stories of the king in hopes of ending their deaths." "Of course, I would be happy to help," ShandraLa answered. I can provide you with 3 seahorses right away who are already trained, and if you need more, I will train more. I will also help gather food and building supplies to send in the sleds." "Thanks, ShandraLa," Appy said with a smile. "I knew we could count on you." "Any time," ShandraLa replied, smiling back. Time passed as the group sent many loads of food and building supplies to the faraway people. From time to time, Appy would stop by to give ShandraLa the news on what was happening in the other water. One by one, the people of the other water began to be receptive to the stories of the king. They began to love the king and give up their selfish ways, knowing that living to help others would pay off when they reached the king's land. And they began to see that helping others and loving the king had benefits even now in their underwater world. For one thing, their interpersonal relationships began to be a real joy to them for the first time in their remembered history. Also, they found that much more could be accomplished as they worked together than before when it was every man for himself. But the unexpected benefit was that their world began to change, as if in response to the change in the hearts of the people. Their own waters and muddy water bottoms began to produce food and building supplies in abundance, as ShandraLa's water did. All the work Appy and ShandraLa and their friends had done had paid off even more handsomely than they had ever imagined when they started. Because ShandraLa finally agreed to come with Appy and the others to see for herself what was happening, she got to see the most exciting moment, the climax of all they had been working towards. She was there when the first dweller of the other water morphed instead of dying. While they were busy telling the king's stories to a group of children, someone came and told them that an ancient man who now loved the king was nearing his last moment. Dropping everything they were doing, the group rushed to the man's bedside, in time to see the bubble coming for him. Ohs and ahs of anticipation rose from the crowd. Before their very eyes, the bubble enveloped the old man, and he changed into a young man. Legs covered with shiny white pants, with feet at the ends, took the place of his scales and tail fins, and finally, dragonfly wings sprouted from his shoulder blades. More than all the physical changes, though, what stood out the most to ShandraLa was the look of delight and joy on the man's face and in his eyes. Waving and smiling, the man rose up through the water toward the shimmering surface. The crowd stood watching until he popped through, and then broke into cheers. It had worked! They had done it! The lives of the other water dwellers would never be the same. Shortly after Appy and ShandraLa returned to their own water, they decided to marry each other, and life went on much as it had before. One by one, children came into their family. Each was greeted with delight and excitement, and Appy and ShandraLa carefully passed on to their children the stories of the king, who loved them and had planned all kinds of good things for them to do during their lifetimes. In the same way, their children grew up and taught their grandchildren about the king, and eventually the time came for Appy and ShandraLa to morph. To be continued.